So, as I said earlier, we'll get on to trust games, and here we have the details of how the trust game works. So, in this situation, player A is given some cash, and they've got to decide how much they're going to give to another player B. Now, the amount that B is given is increased by a fixed factor, so it's doubled. So if I'm player A, if I've been given £10, I might give £2 to player B, then their £2 is doubled, they now have £4. They then decide how much they're going to return to me. Okay, so if they've got £4, I might say, hey, I'll sling back Rob his original 2. And in the jargon that some people have adapted, as you'll read in the literature, is that A's decision, how much they'll give to B, is a measure of trust, and then B's decision on how much they'll pay back to reward A is called trustworthiness. So it's another example of these everyday words people are trying to operationalise and give a more precise but possibly narrow meaning to. And this article, which is in the reading list by Cross and Buchanan, they found that on average, when they do this experiment, that men trust more and women reciprocate more, so they are more trustworthy. Now, getting to a developing country example, this I can just give you the outline of this, but like the other case studies in this lecture, I really recommend that you read some of these, both because of the interest in the real economic situation and also because of the methodological interest in how they really set these things up, because those details matter. So this was played in Kenya, in an area they describe as a slum area, informal dwelling area of Embakasi in Nairobi. And it's near or past the Kibera slum that's more well known. So they played it in groups of 4, and it's played in combinations. Sometimes the group is all male, sometimes the group is all female, and sometimes the group is mixed sex. And the reason for doing this, which I can't go into great detail, is that they're trying to work out why it is that so many of the activities which take place in terms of contributing to public goods, so in terms of keeping the area tidy, coming together to make these joint community schools, the Harambee, we mean pulled together schools, public health initiatives, water supply initiatives, very often it's women's groups that do this, and all women with minimal or no male involvement. And you don't seem to see the equivalent happening of mixed sex groups or in all male settings. It seems to be all female groups dominating that sort of volunteerist mixed public group space. So that's the setup experimentally. And what they find. Well, in public to a game you have 4 players, and each player is given, say, your £10, and each player then decides how much they will give to a common pot or common fund. And the idea is that if each player just stayed with their £10, then at the end of the game they'd sit with their £10, that's what they get. However, if they contribute, then whatever is put into that common pot is multiplied. It could be by 1.5 or 2 or 3 to represent an investment return. So let's say it's doubled. So if every player puts in £5, so they keep 5, put in 5, then with 4 players you'd have a total of £20. That will then be doubled to £40, shared out between the 4 players, so everybody gets another 10 back. So instead of 10, each player ends up with 15. And clearly the idea is that everybody puts in their £10, and so you get 40. That's doubled to 80, and then everybody gets 20 back. So the optimum outcome is for everybody to put in their full £10, except of course that it isn't. At an individual level, the optimum that can happen is for everybody else to put in their £10, but for you to default and put in nothing. So you sit with your £10, the other 3 put in their £10, so you have £30, which is double to 60. You get your share of that, which is 15. So you've now 25. Everybody else has only got 15 for them, but you've done well. So it's one of these situations where if you cooperate, you can really do much better than you can if nobody cooperates. But any individual person, by withdrawing their cooperation, does even better again. So what they've done here is they've looked at the amount that is contributed in different settings. So you can see what you're reading here is 15% here. 50% of people gave less than 15. 70% of people gave less than 20. 90% gave less than 30, and so on. I think 50 must have been the amount. But you can see that there's a pretty similar pattern. 3 of these groups, but one group is giving less at every level. So this group here, who gave 5, 30% gave at least 5, but 40% gave at least 5 on this level. Here, yeah, 15 here, so about 50-60% gave 15 or less. 70% gave 15 or less here. So this group at each level is giving less. So how many gave less than 15? That accounts for 50-60, but 70 or more percent of this group. So a higher percentage of this group gives less than any given number. It seems to be distinct from here. So contributions at every level are lower in this group. And here's the key. The contributions those are females in mixed groups. So there's very little difference in average contributions between all men together, all females together, men when they're with other men. But when women are in groups with other men, so when women are in groups with men, that is when, on average, they systematically give distinctly less. So that's what stands out. And again, nice quant evidence followed up with some interesting qualitative data to explain. And the reason seems to go very well with that evidence, which is that they just expected that men would give less. And there's some nice quotes in there. They expect that men will just eat the money if they get a chance, and you'll never see them again, sort of thing. So it's that expectation of the behaviour of others dictates their expectation, whereas men didn't have that expectation of women, and they didn't have it of each other. Okay, some variations which give some nice extra detail. This is a variation on the dictator game. Now, it starts off with standard dictator game setup. So people, and again, it's very hard to describe. It's quite an elaborate setup because they're trying to make it double blind. So usually the dictator type games, it's single blind in developing country context, but that in the pretty kind of practical physical context where they're handling real cash as opposed to computers. Here they were trying to make it so that the researchers didn't know either who was giving what. So in a closed room, each player is presented with 2 evidence. So player A gets these 2 evidence. And initially, A is always the one that decides how much cash goes in A and B. But in the first framing approach, A is given the 2 envelopes and told, okay, you can decide how much you're going to put into B's envelope. That's the usual dictator game. And B just has to accept what they get. But Olivia now, that they introduced this interesting variant where A is told, okay, you can decide how much you're going to give to B's envelope, or how much you're going to take out, because there's money in both envelopes. They found, again, in the straightforward dictator game, women give substantially more than men, and that difference stands up to repeated trials. But in the take frame, the difference is very similar. No statistically significant differences between men and women when they're told, okay, you can give or take. A slight aside on possible explanations for all of this. Again, some articles I recommend you have a look at, particularly the Stavrum one. It's an argument that says much more about the biology than many others do. It's some quite interesting stuff, even though they also do bring in the institutional stuff, the formal laws, the social norms, the enculturation effects. But some quite interesting stuff on the biology. So, of course, the stuff that everybody knows is testosterone. You think that can be associated with more competitive, assertive behaviour, a desire for higher rewards. And indeed, they did find that, and this is doing with market traders, a lot of this research they're talking about was done in the run-up to the 2008 crash, researching how men and women behave differently in trading situations like financial derivatives and so on, futures markets. So they found that indeed there were higher levels of testosterone associated in men when men got high rewards, and men had, of course, statistically far higher levels of testosterone on average, and not only that, they react more strongly to the testosterone they have, and it's associated with going for higher rewards. So that effect was there, but they did find that even more interesting variation was in this other hormone called cortisol. Now, whereas this is associated with high levels of reward, this cortisol, which men also have in higher amounts, was related to higher rewards, or there's a higher presence of this when the variation of reward is higher. So as opposed to levels, you're looking at variability of risk. So people are getting a thrill or a buzz from the very fact that today my rewards are up, but they might collapse. Men and women are both sensitive to this in similar ways, except that women also produce more of this oxytocin, which counteracts the effect of cortisol and makes them take more calm decisions, which are less influenced by this kind of variability reward. They even got some male traders to randomly be subject to a nasal spray of cortisol, and that was then shown to moderate their excessive risk taking. This article, by the way, is called the Lehman Brothers, the Lehman Sisters hypothesis, saying that Lehman Brothers, the famous bank that collapsed on the eve of the financial crisis, and in many ways was the trigger for that, at least in the States, it would have been very different if they'd been Lehman Sisters, because quite a lot of research suggests that women in these situations, even though they are far underrepresented, because perhaps they're not so assertive and so on, for many other reasons, in actual fact the women that are there are more effective traders because they don't overreact and overvalue risks and make unnecessary trades, and they're at less risk of losing. And even Warren Buffett wrote or gave a piece of advice saying that you should trade more like your sister than a Lehman brother. So that thoroughly recommended. So why do men and women make differences? Well, one is biology. Another thing people have looked at is, and this is clear, the formal difference. If there are laws about whether you can inherit property, then that's clearly going to make a difference to the way you trade and do business. If you think that your inheritance is not secure, if you think your ability to own property is not secure, you won't get access to courts in the case of disputes. You can't travel around freely. When there are really interesting articles on women trading just from home because it's so difficult to move around and overcoming these barriers, but they clearly are barriers. And similarly, employment rights and registering business. We'll have examples of these later and indeed next week. So these are the formal laws, and then similarly the social norms, so the informally enforced laws that exist within social institutions. So that if men have got social pressure and social laws to be like this, assertive, risk-taking, individualist providers, whereas women have got social norms to be docile, risk-averse, more focused on their family, their collective, and as carers rather than careerists, then those social norms clearly have another explanatory effect. I wanted to look at those possible explanations before going on to the next couple of bits about the Levy experiment. Remember, this is the experiment with the dictatorship game where you've got an alternative framing where you can tank as well as give. In the double-blind situation, A's choice is completely secret. They also set up an observed situation, whereas A's choice is revealed to an audience of people. Literally was an audience in a room that didn't include the partner B. They still don't know what's going on, but other players of the game who is not B, randomly selected, are watching. And observation did make a big difference. In a normal situation, when you said, okay, now you can give, how much are you going to offer this other person? Sorry, it's dictator's game, give this other person. It increased the giving in the normal give frame. But when you change it to the frame about tanking, so okay, you can tank or give something to this B, females reduced their tanking, but the giving wasn't changed. And males increased the giving, but the tanking was not changed. So it was as if there was a social norm that females shouldn't take. So if they find themselves in a situation where they're being observed, then suddenly that social norm is triggered and they really have to reduce taking. And similarly, a social laws a social obligation that men should be giving, but in fact normally they don't. So this social norm is triggered and they do start to give. So observations seem to make a big difference. And then we have this intriguing experiment. Now, if you pause the video for a second and say, what does that remind you of? Does it make you feel anything? Does it make you feel more at ease or less at ease? And then unpause and go on to that. Does that make you feel more at ease or less at ease? And does it remind you of anything? And Rigdon found that playing the dictatorship game, and on the piece of paper where people had to decide, okay, how much you're going to offer to the other player, he found that just like this situation here, the contributions increased, but only for men, when that was printed in the corner of the sheets, either this one or that one. And the idea is that this one just meant to trigger some sort of idea that you're being watched, even though it's not explained, it's just printed in the paper, and that doesn't trigger it. So seeing this triggers something in the players that makes them think they're being observed, and that makes the men give more. So, as a summary of the differences that we think we have evidence for, there are persistent gender differences, including women being more generally egalitarian and being more risk averse. But these things all vary greatly with context, and like many other things, these things have been subject to the reproducibility crisis that's affected all kinds of behavioural psychology and behaviour economics. So some of the more interesting, shall we say, things don't hold up so well, but it's hard to say there are not some factors which do persistently show up. So it interacts with many factors, which makes it hard to pick the real effect out from the noise. And there do seem to be some role for all these things. So physical things, laws, and norms. Okay, now before we have another slight pause, maybe before you, if you're watching this in sections, before you go on to the next section, in pairs with this, the class, but in pairs with whoever you're in lockdown with, just to give some context to the next part, just choose one of these and think, is that market gender neutral or is that market gendered? And if it's gendered, what is gendered about it? Why is it gendered? And if you had to put a number on it, would you say you've got a 0, not at all gendered, up to 10, extremely gendered? Okay. Okay, we can press pause now, but this will be in a separate video as well if you're watching it separately.